World War II was a massive undertaking. And we can tell the stories and we can look at the numbers, but I don't think we really comprehend the scale of what we're talking about. So it's time to do the math of war. What do I mean by the math of war? It's the calculation that logisticians and planners use to determine strategy, tactics, supply, and procurement. Procurement is recruiting or drafting the right number of bodies, enough bodies for the military's needs. The question of do we need women in the World War II military is answered by the math of war. Put simply, war is a numbers game. Depending on the type of warfare and the goals of the combatants, different militaries will have different requirements. We could discuss the makeup of the army, conscripts or volunteers or professionals, but that gets very complicated very quickly, and that is another video that is expanding, and it will happen eventually. That's not what we're talking about here. Instead, I'm going to start from the realization that there are jobs besides fighting in an army. You need support soldiers. Specifically, there's this concept called the tooth-to-tail ratio, or the T3R. Generally speaking, that is the ratio for every one combat soldier you have X number of support soldiers. By about World War I, the US is deploying roughly 1-to-1. So for every combat soldier, they are also deploying a support soldier. By the time we get to World War II, it's about 1-to-4. So for every combat soldier they're deploying, they are deploying 3 to 4 support soldiers. That ratio in deployments has held pretty much up until Vietnam, where about 1/3 to 1/4 of the entire deployed force is combat soldiers, and the rest are support soldiers. What I'm saying is a fighting force needs much more support than we think. And if we're talking in terms of the number of soldiers in theater, we need to figure out how many of them are combat and how many of them are support. Okay, we're going back to World War II. And the other wrinkle that we have to deal with is that technology has been increasing at an astronomical rate. We've got all kinds of new technologies that are brand new or were in their infancy in the last war. Things like planes, things like radio and telephones. And in the interim between 1918 and 1940, armies globally are shifting from horses and cannons to trucks and tanks. And sure, we can get away with no longer having grooms or fodder or things like that when we don't have horses. But now you need mechanics and you need armor specialists to care for those tanks and to operate those tanks. And maybe you only had one drover, but you have 4 people in the tank. What I'm saying is, changing technology at this point in history is dramatically increasing the manpower needs of the military. Planners are identifying all of the jobs that go with these new technologies. Since 1918, a lot of these new jobs are bureaucratic, secretarial work, administrative work, clerking. There is also a new need for things like drivers and motor pool workers, mechanics. We also need things like coast watchers because the enemy has long-range aircraft and U-boats, submarines, and they can get to our coast. We also need things like meteorologists because we have planes now and we need to know what the weather is. One of the things that you can do from planes is take pictures of enemy formations. Well, someone has to develop those pictures and someone else has to analyze those pictures. We also see an increase in the medical department as we learn more and more about health and medicine. And so we're seeing an increased demand for people like nutritionists and dietitians and pharmacists. And finally, a lot of new technologies are coming from the military, from their own research and development labs that need to be filled with chemists and physicists and engineers. None of these people are going to go into combat, but they are absolutely vital to the function of the military. The U.S. in 1941 does not have the population to support a military this large. And this is where the math of war comes into play. So we've got two different things to work with. We have the paper army, the authorized army, and then what actually happened. So the World War II authorized army is 90 divisions. Now, roughly, a division is anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 people. So we extrapolate that out, and that is between 900,000 and 1.35 million troops. That is the authorized military. The U.S. deployed 16 million people during World War II. So yeah, there's the gap between what was authorized and what actually happened. In order for the math of war to work, we need to bring on a couple of other ideas. The main one is the casualty rate. Armies are going to war and they're going to have casualties. That's a thing that happens. Men are killed, men are wounded, and they need to be replaced. And an army needs to have a certain minimum number of troops in order to maintain combat effectiveness. Now, when we're looking at World War II, the U.S. actually maintains about 6% casualty rate during World War II, but because we are doing some very rough calculations, I'm keeping it to nice round numbers. We're keeping it at 10%, so it's just easier to figure it out. Do keep in mind these are rough calculations, but they're close enough that you will get the pressures that we're talking about here. For this calculation, I'm going to use the actual casualty figures from World War II. Now, excuse me for a moment while I read off the actual numbers. The U.S. lost 884,135 killed and wounded in World War II. Now, that's over the course of the whole 4 years that the U.S. is involved in the war, so I divided by 4, which gave us 221,034 approximately per year. So I went with 200,000. We'll say that if we are planning on absorbing 200,000 casualties during World War II, how big of a military do we need? That's where we're starting. 200,000 is 10% of the entire army, which means that the entire army must be 2 million men in order to support that casualty rate. Okay, that's not that far off from that 1.35 million that we saw from the paper army calculations. But we need to take into account the tooth to tail ratio, the T3R. We have an army of 2 million. We don't have an army of 2 million total. We have an army of 2 million combat soldiers because we are going to lose 200,000 in combat. So we have 2 million combat soldiers, which means we need another 3 times that. So out of every 4 soldiers, 3 are support and 1 is combat. So we've got 2 million combat soldiers. We need 6 million support soldiers. The total army there, 8 million. All right, that's a bigger number. We can maybe work with that. But now we have to consider, where are these men coming from? They're coming from the general population. And a lot of people say, well, the population of the U.S. is 136 million, according to the 1940 census. And yes, that's true. But when we're doing the math of war, we are looking at who are we going to be pulling from. And in 1940, the U.S. is pulling from a pool of men ages 18 until the day before their 45th birthday. So 18 to 45 is what we say. And there are a lot of restrictions on who is eligible for enrollment in the military. Out of that potential pool of enrollees, between 25 and 30% of those people are actually enrolled in the military. So we need 4 times the number of men that we want for our army. We're at 8 million. We need 4 times that. So we need 32 million men in that pool of potential members of the military. What are the rules for suitability? They have to be healthy, physically fit, things like that. They also have to be not the last child in their family. They need to be not already working in an essential war job. They need to not be a farmer. They need to be not in college. There are school deferments, and at least in 1941 and 42, not a father, because we have exempted fathers. Eventually that does go away, and I do recommend that you check out Amy Rutenberg's book, Rough Draft. Information is in the description below for the citation, and you will be able to get a much more in-depth analysis of what is happening with the draft and how we get that number of 25 to 30%. The other thing to remember is that pool of enrollees is not every single man in the U.S. We don't just take the U.S. population of 136 million and cut it in half, and those are our men, because those are men of all ages, including infants to men over age 100. The U.S. is specifically looking for men ages 18 to 45. Once we get our men ages 18 to 45, we need to go through them and see how many of them are actually fit for military service and how many of them are falling under those exemptions. And that is the pool that we're drawing from for our necessary pool of 32 million men. Per the 1940 U.S. Census, there are between 21 and 27 million men between the ages of 18 and 45 in the U.S. at this point in time. That number is a bit squishy because the U.S. Census actually groups men 15 to 19 altogether. Basically, 21 million is not including men 15 to 19, and 27 million is including all of the men 15 to 19. Even if I take the estimated casualties down to 100,000, we're still going to get a similar answer. Let's think back to the paper army that we talked about at the start of the video. The low estimate is 90,000 men. The high estimate is 1.35 million men. 10% of 900,000, 90,000. 10% of 1.35 million, 135,000. So 100,000 fits in between. We're somewhere in the middle, and we're going to work the numbers with 100,000. 100,000 casualties gives us an army of 1 million combat troops, which gives us a set of 3 million support troops for a total army of 4 million troops, which requires an enrollee pool of 16 million men from, at best, 27 million men. Just doing the math shows us that women needed to be included in the World War II Army.